on some of those responsible for the violence, and we continue to work with international partners to support a free and open civil society and media in Georgia.
Whereas, Mr. Speaker, last month at the Council of Europe, I met several Georgian opposition members. They showed me graphic evidence of the brutal physical abuse meted out at the hands of the Georgian regime before, during and since the recent parliamentary elections. Bidzina Ivanishvili, the Putin-backed oligarch and de facto ruler of Georgia, continues to suppress peaceful process using an identical modus operandi that is used in Russia. Violence and intimidation are distorting the political process. The United States has imposed sanctions on Ivanishvili, but much of Ivanishvili's wealth is based in the UK or British overseas territories. Will the Minister commit to the UK joining our allies and freezing the assets of such a despicable tyrant?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I first thank him and his fellow members of the PACE delegation for the important work they're doing, including on this issue of Georgia. It's hugely important that we stand together with fellow Europeans in the Council of Europe on these matters. In coordination with the US, the United Kingdom imposed sanctions, as I said, against the Minister and Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs and 3 police chiefs responsible for violence attacks against journalists and peaceful protesters in Georgia. He will understand that while we continue to closely monitor the evolving situation in Georgia, we do not comment on potential future sanctions designations, as to do so would lessen their impact.
Mr. Speaker, the European Parliament recently recognised Salome Zurabishvili as the rightful president of Georgia. The protesters on the streets of Tbilisi day in, day out agree with that view. She's met with President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and she attended the recent inauguration of the US President. Will the Minister commit to meeting with Madame Zurabishvili next time she visits the UK?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we continue to engage with a range of figures in Georgia. We continue to engage with all of those who seek a Euro-Atlantic path for Georgia, as indeed is defined in their own constitution and the wishes of their people, and we'll continue to work closely with European counterparts on that issue.
Number 10,
Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The slave trade was abhorrent. We recognise its horrific impacts and the ongoing strength of feeling, but there have been no such discussions. As the Foreign Secretary made clear to the Foreign Affairs Committee after Chogam, in his words, there was no discussion about reparation and money, and the Prime Minister and I were absolutely clear that we will not be making cash transfers and payments to the Caribbean. We are focused, Mr. Speaker, on working with our Caribbean partners to tackle the most pressuring... No problem, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, we are focused on working with our Caribbean partners to tackle the most pressuring challenges of today and the future, including security, growth and climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week saw the 38th Ordinary Session of the African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government, the topic of which was justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. Caribbean heads of state were also present, and we know that CARICOM have long engaged in discussions on reparative justice. Whether we participate in these discussions or not, they will continue to happen. Does the Minister accept that the world and its power structures are changing, and in our turbulent post-Brexit reality, we need allies and friends, but we won't even say that we are sorry, and we'll be foolish to think that we are not deeply resented for this? Is it not better for the UK to engage in these discussions to ensure that we actually play a constructive role in addressing the enduring legacies of slavery and colonialism?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We recognise that this is an issue of enduring concern to many. We do listen to views from our Caribbean partners on the full range of bilateral issues, but our policy on reparations is clear. We do not pay them. We are determined to work together for the future.
Objective.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quick question. To what extent does the government support CARICOM's 10-point plan for reparatory justice?
As I just stated, Mr. Speaker, our policy on reparations is clear. We do not pay them. Thank you.
Rachel Muskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 11.
Foreign Secretary.
Ending the conflict in Sudan is a personal priority for me, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited the Ardre border with the Chadian Foreign Minister to increase international attention on Sudan and meet with Sudanese civilians who are bearing the brunt of this crisis. I'm very happy to announce that I will be convening foreign ministers in London in April around the second anniversary of the outbreak of the civil war in Sudan to foster international consensus on a path to ending the conflict.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank the Foreign Secretary for all that he is doing. Like so many conflicts, the discourse over this brutal Sudanese war is being fuelled by external actors to Sudan, with economic and mineral interest in the country, as well as wider geopolitical agitation. Interest of countries like Russia, like Egypt with its support for the SAF, and the UAE ARC with support for the RSF, and the wider use of mercenaries. So what further steps can the Foreign Secretary take to use our leverage, not least our trading leverage, to ensure that actors are not fuelling this horrendous war and humanitarian crisis?
Well, the Honourable Lady will be pleased that I raised these issues at the G20 in my contribution. I had a lengthy discussion with Amina Mohammed of the United Nations, with the Foreign Minister of Angola, and with President Ramaphosa on the situation in Sudan. I'm looking forward to convening this conference in London, working with the French and with the African Union, and I hope that all international partners, we continue to emphasise the importance of this, of refraining from actions that prolong the conflict.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has indicated that he's going to have further discussions along with the African Union. Given that there are about 9 million people displaced in what is one of the most, if not the most, significant humanitarian catastrophe the world faces today, can he impress upon the African Union and partners the need for urgent action to try and resolve this?
Well, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and I didn't just go to the Ardre crossing to spend time with the overwhelming women and children who are fleeing this conflict, but it was important also to announce £20 million in additional support to refugees, and particularly access to reproductive and sexual health services on that border. It's grim, it's horrific, it's had too little attention, and I intend to do all we can to bring this to an end.
Andrew Pegs.
Number 12, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 28th of January, we announced a further £17 million for healthcare, food and shelter, and to support vital infrastructure across the occupied Palestinian territories. This was an investment in the ceasefire, which must hold. Thank you.
Andrew Pegs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is utterly heartbreaking seeing the desecration of hostages' bodies, but also seeing men, women and children return to Gaza to try and rebuild their lives amongst the rubble. So can I welcome the government's efforts on humanitarian aid in this fragile ceasefire, a ceasefire that risks becoming even more fragile with tanks rolling into the West Bank. Can the Minister update the House on what more we can do to ensure the ceasefire is implemented in full and that we also protect human rights and communities in the West Bank?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I know that many across the House will share his revulsion and concern at those scenes. We are committed to working with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, the US and regional partners to build confidence in the ceasefire, support conditions for a permanent and sustainable peace, including Palestinian reconstruction as well. To support immediate needs, Mr. Speaker, £2 million of the recently announced funding has been committed to critical water and energy infrastructure projects. Thank you.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've added the House to my register of interest. I recently visited Israel as part of a delegation from this place and met politicians from across the political spectrum. Some support the current Israeli government's approach, others do not. But what unites them is criticism of the UK government's continued support of UNRWA. Will the government please reconsider support of UNRWA?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. I have also had those discussions both in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. And I do recognise that there was, of course, particularly concern around the events that led to the production of the Colonna report, really disturbing allegations of involvement of UNRWA staff. As was mentioned previously, there are also concerns around reports that Emily Damari may have been placed within an UNRWA camp. We have taken this up with UNRWA. We indeed have supported them around their reform agenda. They have delivered change, and they are the only organisation that can deliver the humanitarian support that is desperately needed right now for millions of Palestinians. Thank you.
Ketos.
Question number 14.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We remain desperately concerned about the humanitarian situation in Sudan. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, set out the measures that have been taken by the UK to seek to ameliorate that appalling disaster, which has included a doubling of aid to Sudan.
I think the book, Minister, the grouped.
My apologies, Mr. Speaker. I'm taking the group 14, 16 and 21. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her response. In recent days, Sudanese army forces have advanced into El Abed, the capital of North Kordofan state, ending a 2-year siege by the Rapid Support Forces. This has caused serious food shortages within North Kordofan, being deemed to be suffering conditions under the Integrated Food Security Phase classification. Please, could the Minister confirm what the government is doing to ensure aid is fast-tracked into the city?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, because the situation she describes is intolerable. I was very grateful to international counterparts who attended a discussion on these subjects that we took part in the Munich Security Conference. She talked about the famine designation. We regret the fact that the SAF has now indicated it will not cooperate with assessment of famine, but of course we've seen both the RSF and the SAF restricting aid, using it as a weapon of war. That must end.
Valera Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Genocide 8020 campaign group at Hampton School in my constituency recently met with members of the Darfur diaspora who fled the atrocities in Sudan. They would like to know what the UK government is doing to help those targeted simply for who they are. So, Mr. Speaker, with a staggering 16 million children desperately needing food, shelter, healthcare and education, could I ask the Minister for assurances that we won't see any cuts to UK aid to the region, and what assessment she has made of the impact of the Trump administration's cuts to US aid?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. She's right to raise some of the disturbing accounts of atrocities that we have heard, and she will be pleased to know that the UK led efforts to renew the UN Human Rights Council fact-finding mission mandate in October of last year. I was very pleased to see additional African countries coming on board with that. We have doubled our aid to Sudan, Mr. Speaker, so that commitment is not in doubt. Thank you.
Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's pushing ceasefire in Sudan and doubling aid. Sudan's civil war, now in its 3rd year, has triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises of the decade, with 5.1 million internally displaced and 1.3 million seeking refugees since April 2023, and famine now looming. Given this, can the Minister outline what urgent steps the government is taking with their international counterparts to help de-escalate the conflict in Sudan?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ending the conflict in Sudan and the appalling consequences of it is a UK priority. Both the Foreign Secretary and I have visited the region, including Chad and South Sudan. We have increased aid. We have been determined to increase international attention. That includes the April conference that the Foreign Secretary referred to, but also the fact that I convened development ministers from a number of countries a few days ago with the Emergency Relief Coordinator to try and pile on the pressure.
Seamus Logan.
Mr. Speaker, the last time the Minister was in front of the House talking about Sudan, she told us that it was important to have trust in the international system. Given that the RSF, accused of ethnic cleansing and genocide, and so far acting with complete impunity, have just pledged to form a rival government, what is the UK government doing to garner this trust in the international system and to hold them to account.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I regret that we see both parties to the conflict behaving in a manner that is having a truly catastrophic impact on civilians. We see famine, we see appalling levels of conflict-related sexual violence, and the international community must step up. That is indeed why the Foreign Secretary is seeking to convene leaders around this in April. It's why I've pulled together development ministers on this. It's why we've repeatedly raised these issues at the UN as well.
Well done.
Question 15, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The UK government is committed to human rights in Sri Lanka and is leading international efforts to promote accountability in human rights, including at the UN Human Rights Council. And at a visit last month to Sri Lanka, I raised these issues with ministers of the new government in Colombo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is over 15 years since the end of the bloody civil war in Sri Lanka. Those responsible for the many war crimes committed during that conflict, including targeting of civilians and sexual violence, have still not been held accountable. In opposition, the Foreign Secretary called out on the government to follow the example of our allies, including the US and Canada, in imposing sanctions against individuals suspected of committing those appalling acts. Now he's in government, would he commit to finally doing so?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In October of 2024, the UK and our core group partners led a resolution on Sri Lanka at the UN Human Rights Council outlining just what he is saying, renewing the mandate of the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights to report regularly on Sri Lanka to protect and preserve evidence to use in future accountability processes. And we consider a range of justice and accountability options, including sanctions, and keep evidence and any potential designations under close review.
Right, we come to the top of those. Alison Bennett.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
As I set out in the House yesterday, securing a lasting peace that safeguards Ukraine's sovereignty for the long term is essential. To achieve this, Europe and the United States must provide the support Ukraine needs to stay strong. Ukraine must be at the heart of any talks. The UK is playing a leading role on assistance to Ukraine, on pressure on Russia, and on keeping our allies united.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the government bring forward emergency legislation to seize frozen Russian assets and ensure they are repurposed to support Ukraine in the wake of Trump's talks with Putin? And if not, could the Foreign Secretary explain why not?
The Honourable Lady raises an important issue. It's not an issue on which any government can act alone. We must act with European allies. It was a topic of conversation at the G7. It was a topic of conversation at the Weimar Group. And of course, Europe has to act quickly. And I believe we should move from freezing assets to seizing assets.
Joe Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Gaza ceasefire deal remains fragile, and as we enter the final week of the ceasefire's first phase, it's crucial that both the Israeli and Palestinian governments continue to uphold the agreement and reunite families with dignity. Can the Minister assure me that this government will continue to support the ceasefire deal into its remaining stages and work with international partners such as Jordan and Egypt to secure a lasting peace?
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that we will continue to support the ceasefire deal through all three of its phases, which we hope to see concluded in full. And I'm working with international partners, as are other ministers, and I saw the Jordanian and Egyptian ambassadors on this question just last week.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
This House stands united with the people of Ukraine. So in light of Putin's brutality towards the people of Ukraine, what discussions will the Foreign Secretary be having with allies, including his American counterparts, on the international effort to prosecute Russia for invading Ukraine and the sheer barbarism that they have inflicted upon the people of Ukraine?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for raising the issue of justice and accountability. And she knows this work begun, of course, under the last government, that we led the world in ensuring that there were sufficient funds in Ukraine, and the Foreign Office does support lawyers working in Ukraine to gather that evidence. I'll never forget the scenes that I saw in Bucha and the victims that I've stood with. The UK will not let up on justice, and Putin should pay in terms of his accountability, not the British and European people.
Deputy Peter.
Speaker, Russia, Iran, China all pose threats to Britain and they go out of their way to do us harm. So can the Foreign Secretary explain why the government has yet to implement the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, which the last government legislated for, and can he confirm when it will come in and whether or not China will be on the enhanced tier?
Well, she raises again an important issue. We inherited a process that wasn't quite working, and she knows these issues, and we will come forward shortly with our plans under the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The ICJ delivered their advisory opinion last July and made it absolutely crystal clear that the illegal settlements at that time were just that, unlawful. And yet we have seen threats to displace Gazans, we've seen tanks in the West Bank. When will the government deliver their response to the advisory opinion, and will it be before the conference in Switzerland in a few weeks' time?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the question and her long commitment to these issues. As I made clear during the Westminster Hall debate on the 12th of February, UK respects the independence of the ICJ. We're considering the Court's advisory opinion with the rigour and the seriousness it deserves. We remain clear Israel should bring an end to its presence in the occupied Palestinian territories as rapidly as possible, whilst making every effort to create the conditions for negotiations towards a two-state solution.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House will be shocked to learn the worrying news that the mother of British-Egyptian political prisoner Alaa Abdel Fattah, Laila Suif, was admitted to St Thomas's Hospital last night. She's 68 years old and has been on hunger strike now for 149 days. Can the Foreign Secretary update us on whether the Prime Minister has now spoken to the Egyptian President to secure the release of Alaa Abdel Fattah and allow Laila to break her strike?
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House are engaged in this case, and we all are hoping for Laila's health. The Prime Minister met with Laila and the rest of her family recently, and I was pleased to join them. The Prime Minister has undertaken to take every effort that he can in order to try and ensure Alaa's release, and we will continue to do so.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having recently returned from Camp Viking, the hub for UK Commando forces in the High North, I witnessed the vital role it plays in our strategic defence efforts. Can I ask the Minister what engagement he's had with Norwegian counterparts to counter Russian aggression and strengthen our collective security in the region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was delighted he's visited those incredible commandos up there training. I too have visited them in the past, our Royal Marines and Army commandos in the High North in Norway, and I've witnessed the vital role that they play in our strategic defence efforts. The UK and Norway work closely together as NATO and JEF allies. Our Prime Minister signed a strategic partnership in December, and last week the Defence Secretary also visited Norway to launch a new agreement on deeper defence cooperation. Myself and the Foreign Secretary have also visited with our counterparts, and I can tell you that security and defence cooperation were absolutely at the heart of our efforts and our discussions with our Norwegian friends.
Monica Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Trump and Elon Musk slashing US aid was a great day for Russia and China. Will the Foreign Secretary avoid giving them another great day by committing to protect the UK's development budget, even as we raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, because he knows that preventing wars is cheaper than fighting them?
What can I say to the Honourable Lady? That I'm proud of the work that the UK has done over many decades in relation to development, the work that I've seen in Ukraine, the work that I've seen in Gaza, the work that I've seen in Sudan. All of this work will of course continue.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The security of Europe is absolutely paramount. Can the Secretary of State tell us what new steps he's taking to deter Russia from further invading European borders, given that we are now in a new situation with negotiations undergoing?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I was very pleased yesterday to announce one of the biggest sanction packages that this country has ever seen, to bear down further on Russia's shadow fleet. And I remind the honourable gentleman that interest rates are running at 21%, that inflation is running at 9%. We're doing a lot to take money off the table of Putin to fund his war machine.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In January, the Foreign Office Minister said they would challenge the Northern Ireland Executive to be more robust in its reporting of international affairs and meetings. At the start of this month, the First and Deputy First Minister met again with the Chinese Consul, but still no details of that meeting has been reported or shared, nor previous meetings. Has that challenge been made, and what was the response?
We regularly engage with Northern Ireland on all matters of foreign policy, and specifically in relation to the matter of Chinese consular issue. It's not really for ministers to discuss at the dispatch box.
Joe Powell.
Mr. Speaker, can I warmly welcome the massive sanctions package announced yesterday by the government. But does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that China should be taking a significantly more proactive role in preventing its companies from supplying Russia's military?
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his praise and support for the action we took, as the Foreign Secretary said. This is one of the largest package that we've done since the start of Russia's illegal and barbarous invasion. We are absolutely clear on the principle alongside our G7 allies that Russia must pay for the damage it is causing to Ukraine, and we of course look at third country routes in which support is being given to Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine, and we're taking a number of steps on that in that regard, including with companies in China. That was part of the package yesterday.
Donald Pinkerton.
Last week, the honourable member for Lincoln, the Minister for North Africa and the Middle East, left open the possibility that the FCDO might revisit the issue of explicit carbon monoxide warnings on FCDO travel advisory pages. A change that we contend that would have a cascading effect in the UK travel industry, would drive up the use of carbon monoxide alarms, would save lives of British travellers overseas. Can I encourage the front bench team, please, to pick up this issue in the name of my constituent Hudson Foley, to ensure that the lives of British travellers overseas are kept safe? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm I will be adding information to our dedicated page for independent travellers to highlight the risks of carbon monoxide poisoning globally, and I'll be writing to Cathy Foley, who I was very moved to meet along with the member.
Sonia Kumar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gaza's healthcare system has been devastated, and many civilians are in desperate need for treatment and specialist care which is not available in Gaza itself. Will the Minister ensure the government continues to raise with Israel the importance of allowing safe passage out of Gaza for those children in need of urgent medical treatment, and will it consider additional evacuation routes for critically unwell children?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that important question. We've been working closely with Egypt, which of course has sought to support many of those requiring medical assistance. We continue to look very carefully at this issue, including across government. But of course, Gazans really need that healthcare support in Gaza, and we have been supporting that as the UK government.
James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I'm sure the Treasury bench will know, soft power and diplomacy are most effective when they're backed up by hard power. So when will the government commit to spending 3% of GDP on defence to make sure we have a real voice at the international table? When we encourage European countries to increase their defence spending.
Well, I've got to say to the honourable gentleman, why didn't you decide to do that? You've left this to this government to get back to 2.5%, which we last had as a Labour government. I say to the honourable gentleman, he should have done this. We're going to do it.
I look forward to seeing relations between the UK and Iraq blossom in the years to come under this Labour government. Could the Minister share with me the recent conversations he's had with Iraqi counterparts on reducing barriers to trade, such as diverging trade regimes?
Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased to meet the Iraqi Foreign Minister, Dr. Fuad Hussein, during the official visit of his Prime Minister al-Sudani to the UK from the 14th to the 16th of January. During that visit, our two Prime Ministers signed the landmark Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, a wide-ranging treaty on trade and strategic cooperation, announcing a trade package worth up to £12.3 billion.
Right, we're now changing over the end of questions. Before we start, the Government's own Ministerial Code says that a text of statement should be provided in advance to the Opposition and to the Speaker. It does not provide for the text to be redacted. I am particularly concerned at the reports that some of the redacted information was provided to the media in advance. If correct, that is a very discourteous to this House. I take it very seriously. Or it could well be that it's been leaked, in which case I hope there will be an inquiry to what has happened here. I will therefore ask the Prime Minister to look into what has happened in this case and report back to me and to the House as soon as possible. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by giving my word to this House that this was not given to the media? I will absolutely have an inquiry into this, but I would not be that discourteous. I spoke to you this morning, Mr. Speaker. I wouldn't be discourteous to you or to the Leader of the Opposition in that way, or to the House, and I give you that assurance from this dispatch box. And I apologise to the Leader of the Opposition, and I will make that inquiry. Mr. Speaker, 3 years since Russia launched its vile assault on Ukraine, I would like to address the international situation and the implication for Britain's national security. Mr. Speaker, in my first week as Prime Minister, I travelled to the NATO summit in Washington with a simple message: that NATO and our allies could trust this government would fulfil Britain and indeed the Labour Party's historic role to put our collective security first. I spoke of my great pride, Mr. Speaker, to lead the party that was a founding member of NATO, the inheritor of the legacy of Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin, who not only stood behind Winston Churchill in wartime, but won the peace by establishing the great post-war order here and abroad. Mr. Speaker, it's a proud legacy. But in a world like ours, it's also a heavy one, because the historical load we must carry to fulfil our duty is not as light as it once was. We must bend our backs across this House, because these times demand a united Britain, and we must deploy all of our resources to achieve security. Mr. Speaker, as a young man, I vividly remember the Berlin Wall coming down. It felt as if we were casting off the shackles of history, a continent united by freedom and democracy. If you had told me then that in my lifetime we would see Russian tanks rolling into European cities again, I would not have believed you. Yet here we are, in a world where everything has changed. Because 3 years ago, that is exactly what happened. Britain can be proud of our response. British families opened their doors to fleeing Ukrainians. The yellow and light blue fluttering on town halls and churches, the length and breadth of this country. And the party opposite, in government, was robust in our response. I supported that in opposition. I applaud them for it now. And we have built on that, bringing our support for Ukraine to a record level this year. Mr. Speaker, we should not pretend that any of this has been easy. Working people have already felt the cost of Russian actions through rising prices and bills. Nonetheless, one of the great lessons of our history is that instability in Europe will always wash up on our shores, and that tyrants like Putin only respond to strength. Russia is a menace in our waters, in our airspace, and on our streets. They've launched cyber attacks on our NHS. Only 7 years ago, a chemical weapons attack on the streets of Salisbury. We must stand by Ukraine, because if we do not achieve a lasting peace, then the economic instability, the threats to our security, they will only grow. And so, as the nature of that conflict changes, as it has in recent weeks, it brings our response into sharper focus. A new era that we must meet, as we have so often in the past, together and with strength. Mr. Speaker, the fundamentals of British strategy are unchanged. I know that the current moment is volatile, but there is still no good reason why they cannot endure. So let me spell out to the House exactly how we will renew them for these times. First, NATO is the bedrock of our security and will remain so. Yeah. It has brought peace for 75 years. It is as important today as the day on which it was founded. Putin thought he would weaken NATO. He's achieved the exact opposite. Yeah. And it remains the organisation that receives the vast bulk of our defence effort in every domain, and that must continue. Second, we must reject any false choice between our allies, between one side of the Atlantic or the other. That is against our history, country, and party, because it's against our fundamental national interest. The US is our most important bilateral alliance. It straddles everything from nuclear technology to NATO to Five Eyes, AUKUS, and beyond. It survived countless external challenges in the past. We fought wars together with the closest partners in trade, growth, and security. So this week, when I meet President Trump, I will be clear. I want this relationship to go from strength to strength. Yeah. But, Mr. Speaker, strength in this world also depends on a new alliance with Europe. As I said in Paris last week, our commitment to European defence and security is unwavering. But now is the time to deepen it. So we will find new ways to work together on our collective interests and threats, protecting our borders, bringing our companies together, seeking out new opportunities for growth. Third, Mr. Speaker, we seek peace, not conflict. And we believe in the power of diplomacy to deliver that end. That, of course, is most pressing in Ukraine. Nobody in this House or this country wants the bloodshed to continue. Nobody. And Mr. Speaker, I've seen the devastation in Ukraine firsthand. What you see in places like Bucha, that never leaves you. But for peace to endure in Ukraine and beyond, we need deterrence. I know that this House will endorse the principle of winning peace through strength. Yeah. So we will continue to stand behind the people of Ukraine. We must ensure they negotiate their future, and we'll continue to put them in the strongest position for a lasting peace. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, we must change our national security posture, because a generational challenge requires a generational response. That will demand some extremely difficult and painful choices. And through those choices, as hard as they are, we must also seek unity, a whole society effort that will reach into the lives, the industries, and the homes of the British people. I started this statement by recalling the era of Attlee and Bevin. And of course, this year we will mark many anniversaries of that greatest generation. We must find courage in our history, courage in who we are as a nation, because courage is what our own era now demands of us. So starting today, I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so we reach that level in 2027. And we will maintain that for the rest of this Parliament. And let me spell that out, Mr. Speaker. That means spending £13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we also face enemies that are sophisticated in cyber attacks, sabotage, even assassination. And so our intelligence and security services are an increasingly vital part of protecting both us and our allies. So on top of the funding of 2.5% that I've just announced, going forward we will recognise the incredible contribution of our intelligence and security services to the defence of the nation, which means taken together we will be spending 2.6% on our defence from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we must go further still. I've long argued that in the face of ongoing generational challenges, all European allies must step up and do more for our own defence. So, subject to economic and fiscal conditions, and aligned with our strategic and operational needs, we will also set a clear ambition for defence spending to rise to 3% of GDP in the next Parliament. Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear. The nature of warfare has changed significantly. That is clear from the battlefield in Ukraine. And so we must modernise and reform our capabilities as we invest. I equally want to be very clear that, like any other investment we make, we must seek value for money. And that's why we're putting in place a new defence reform and efficiency plan, jointly led by my right honourable friends, the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary. This investment means that the UK will strengthen its position as a leader in NATO and in the collective defence of our continent. And we should welcome that role. It is good for our national security. It is also good for the defining mission of this government to restore growth to our economy. And we should be optimistic of what it can deliver in those terms. But, Mr. Speaker, in the short term, it can only be funded through hard choices. And in this case, that means we will cut our spending on development assistance, moving from 0.5% of GNI today to 0.3% in 2027, fully funding our increased investment in defence. I want to be clear to the House. That is not an announcement I am happy to make. I'm proud of our pioneering record on overseas development, and we will continue to play a key humanitarian role in Sudan, in Ukraine and in Gaza, tackling climate change, supporting multinational efforts on global health and challenges like vaccination. In recent years, the development budget was redirected towards asylum backlogs, paying for hotels. So as we're clearing that backlog at a record pace, there are efficiencies that will reduce the need to cut spending on our overseas programmes. But nonetheless, it remains a cut, and I will not pretend otherwise. We will do everything we can to return to a world where that is not the case and rebuild a capability on development. But at times like this, the defence and security of the British people must always come first. That is the #1 priority of this government. But, Mr. Speaker, it's not just about spending. Our whole approach to national security must now change. We will have to ask British industry, British universities, British businesses and the British people to play a bigger part. Use this to renew the social contract of our nation, the rights and responsibilities that we owe one another. The first test of our defence policy is, of course, whether it keeps our country safe. But the second should be whether it improves the conditions of the British people. Does it help provide the economic security that working people need? Because ultimately, as Attlee and Bevan knew, that is fundamental to national security as well. We will use this investment as an opportunity. We will translate defence spending into British growth, British jobs, British skills, British innovation. We will use the full powers of the Procurement Act to rebuild our industrial base. And, Mr. Speaker, as the Strategic Defence Review is well underway, and across government we're conducting a number of other reviews relevant to national security, it's obvious that these reviews must pull together. So before the NATO summit in June, we will publish a single national security strategy and we will bring it to this House because, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, that is how we must meet the threats of our age. Together and with strength. A new approach to defence, a revival of our industrial base, a deepening of our alliances, the instruments of our national power brought together, creating opportunity, assuring our allies, delivering security for our country. Mr. Speaker, at moments like these in our past, Britain has stood up to be counted. It has come together and it has demonstrated strength. That is what the security of our country needs now, and it is what this government will deliver. And I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for the partial copy of his statement. And now that I've heard the unredacted bits, I must welcome his response and his fulsome support for Ukraine. This weekend marked a grim milestone. It's now 3 years since Putin's invasion, and the Conservative Party stands resolutely with the people of Ukraine. Our hearts are with those still caught up in this conflict as we remember the many innocent lives lost. I will always be proud of the support the last Conservative government gave in the run-up to Putin's invasion and those first crucial weeks and months of the war. We helped prevent Kiev falling, and we supported Ukraine in regaining territory initially lost to Russia. But it is also true that overall, the West has not done enough to support Ukraine. As has been the case from the outset, it remains ultimately for Ukraine as a proud and sovereign nation that has sacrificed so much to defend itself and the fundamental freedoms that we all hold dear. It is up to them to decide their future. So we want this terrible war to end, but Ukraine needs to be at the negotiating table. And like President Zelensky, we hope for a lasting, reliable peace. But the West must continue to be intensely robust in the face of Putin's aggression. The lesson of the last 20 years is clear. He only comes back for more. The first duty of every government is to protect its people. That means a strong state that stands up for our national interest. Our foreign policy should seek to support our national interest. National interest should always come first. So I'm very pleased to hear the Prime Minister announce that increase to 2.5% by 2027. All of us on this side of the House welcome that. We've all wanted to see more spending on defence. I would ask the Prime Minister, on including the intelligence budget, can he confirm that this is new money for the intelligence services? And does this mean that there will be new money in the next financial year? The Prime Minister will know that I wrote to him at the weekend with suggestions on what we could do to help with increasing defence spending, so I welcome his announcement on repurposing money from the overseas development budget. That is absolutely right. And I look forward to him taking up my other suggestion of looking at what we can do on welfare. He will know that we had a fully funded plan and we urge him to take it up. Having said that, can the Prime Minister say in confidence that 2.7%, the 2.5% by 2027 is sufficient? Because we need to look at exactly how we fund this. He must not raise taxes further, as it will destroy our economy. We need a strong economy to pay for strong defence. He cannot borrow more. We are already spending more on debt interest than defence. We all know that he must make difficult decisions on spending. He has our support to do that. In his statement, the Prime Minister also told us about his new value for money defence reform and efficiency plan. Does he agree that the first thing that must be looked at is spending billions of taxpayer money leasing back a defence base on Diego Garcia that we currently own? Why is the Prime Minister still pursuing this deal? Earlier today, I made a speech about the realism that should drive our foreign policy. As part of this, the Prime Minister must scrap his disastrous plan to surrender the Chagos Islands and have British taxpayers pay for the privilege. The key difference between those of us on this side of the House and the Labour Party is that we know we need a strong economy for defence. We need a serious plan to get the British economy growing again. We do not have that with the latest budget from the Chancellor. So can the Prime Minister tell us if there is going to be a fiscal event this spring, even though his government is committed to only one fiscal event a year? In summary, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister made 4 points. I agree with him that NATO is a bedrock of our security, as I said this morning. And I agree that the US is our most important bilateral relationship. But friends tell each other when they disagree. We agree on this issue. We know that Ukraine must be supported, and I shared the concerns the Prime Minister had about statements that had been made about President Zelensky. I agree with the Prime Minister on protecting security in Europe. I welcome his continuing to strengthen alliances. But we must do that through NATO, building on the Joint Expeditionary Force approach. And we, of course, agree that we need peace with Ukraine, agreed. I don't necessarily agree with his change in the national security posture because we have different views on this. I am a conservative realist, not a progressive internationalist. But I want him to know that when he does the right thing, we will work with him in the national interest.
Prime Minister.
Can I first thank her for her support in relation to today's announcement and her support on Ukraine. That is important to the government, it's important to the House, but mostly it's important to the Ukrainians and to President Zelensky, because they want to see unity in our House. They value unity in our House as they enter, after 3 years of a conflict, a very difficult stage of the war with Russia and the Russian aggression. And I hope and I believe we can maintain that unity in relation to Ukraine. We have for 3 years, and I'm very proud that this House has done that, notwithstanding a change of government for 3 long years. We will continue to do so. She asked about the money on defence and security and intelligence. There was new money at the budget in relation to that, but what I'm doing here is, in addition to the 2.5%, which is the increase in defence spend as it's always been understood, is to recognise that the nature of the threats to our country are different now, and that the security and intelligence services play a key part for us and for our allies in our defence, and that takes the total to 2.6. She asked me if we're going to tax to pay for the 2.5%. 2.5% or to borrow to pay for the 2.5%? The answer to that is no, which is why I've set out precisely pound for pound how we will pay for it today. That has meant a very difficult decision on overseas development, a very difficult decision, and not a decision that I wanted to take or that I'm happy to take. But it is important that we explain where the money will come from in terms and explain where it's coming from today. And I was only ever going to come to the House with a plan, with a timeline in it, a percentage in it, and an answer to the question, how are you going to pay for it? I would not have come to the House with a fanciful plan. And she says they had a plan. She says, of course we did. I've views on it, but the Institute of Government said of their pledge for 2.5% by 2030, Institute for Government, it does not add up, it's not a serious plan. The Institute for Fiscal Studies called it misleading and opaque. I'm not giving my view, I'm giving the view of other bodies having looked at the plan that they put forward. They said they would fund it by cutting the civil service, and then they increased the civil service by 13,000. I'm not prepared to operate in that way, which is why we've taken the difficult decision on overseas development today to be absolutely clear where the money is coming from. In relation to the final point about the approach that we take here and whether there's a difference between us, I hope not. Because what I set out was NATO first as the bedrock of our security. I hope that that is common ground, whatever we may call our respective positions. I also set out that we must not choose between the US and our European allies. That is what I fundamentally believe, and I will resist that choice. I hope that that is common ground between us, notwithstanding the language that she uses, because that is important, not for the exchanges over this dispatch box, but the future defence and security of our country and of Europe. Thank you.
Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tamanji Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement on defence and security because times are changing and we must all recognise that these are pivotal moments, not just for our nation's security, but also for our Ukrainian friends, whom we must wholeheartedly support in their fight for survival. Mr. Speaker, in my role as Defence Committee Chair, during my various interactions with key stakeholders, I've begun to realise that there is considerable consternation amongst our European allies about whether long-established and hard-earned alliances, rather than a short-term transactional approach, can still be relied upon to secure lasting peace. And also, given the proposed decreased American presence in our continent, people are looking for leadership. And I feel that this is our time as a nation to step forward and take that lead on defence and security matters in our continent. So does my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree that he will convey to President Trump and our American allies about our allies' anxieties and the need to strengthen our transatlantic NATO alliance at this perilous time for Europe? And does he also agree that he can be that person to take the lead on defence and security matters in Europe while coalescing our NATO allies?
Can I just gently say, I know you've got a lot to say, but I've got a lot of members to get in. I've still got other bleeders. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I do agree that our alliances are important, and that's why NATO is the bedrock of our approach. It has been for many, many years and will continue to do so. I do accept that European allies and the UK have to step up and do more. In our heart of hearts, I think across this House, we've known that this moment was coming for the last 3 years. And now we've put that plan before the House. And of course, I will do everything I can to strengthen the alliance and the relationship between the US and the UK. It is a special relationship. It is a strong relationship. I want it to go from strength to strength. Thank you.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Red Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for France's cited his statement. 3 years ago, Putin began his brutal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And as we watched Russian missiles rain down on Ukrainian cities, we feared he might have struck a decisive blow to Ukraine and its sovereignty. Yet Putin underestimated the strength of the ideals we share with our Ukrainian friends of democracy, truth and liberty. He underestimated the courage and grit of Ukrainian soldiers who have spent 3 years heroically resisting Putin's war machine. Britain stood together with our allies in support of Ukraine. Families up and down the country opened their doors wide for Ukrainian refugees, because we know that Ukraine's fight for democracy and liberty is our fight too. And in this house together, we stood strong together. And yet 3 years on, the future of Ukraine and security in Europe seems even more perilous. Then, Washington was clearly on our side, but now the United States is voting with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea in the United Nations. President Trump labels President Zelensky a dictator, but not Vladimir Putin. Mr. Speaker, after the Second World War, Britain came together with allies around the world to establish NATO, and with America agreed to underwrite security on this continent, recognizing the threat to the security of one nation was a threat to the security of all nations. Mr. Speaker, the events of the past few days are clear. That era is over. We may be watching before our very eyes the betrayal of our Ukrainian allies by America, and with it the potential betrayal of Europe and of Britain too. We must respond. Now it is up to the United Kingdom to lead in Europe. As a nation, we must seize this moment. Mr. Speaker, it is for our national interest that Liberal Democrats have supported the Prime Minister's proposals on Ukraine, including British troops joining a reassurance mission in Ukraine if a just settlement is reached. And that is why we strongly support the Prime Minister raising defence spending to 2.5%, preferably using seized Russian assets to pay for extra defence support for Ukraine. We will scrutinise all aspects of the government spending plans carefully. But I hope that moving at pace to 2.5% will mean ministers will shortly announce the reversal of the Conservatives' short-sighted cut of 10,000 troops from our armed forces. But, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right. We must go further. So will the Prime Minister initiate talks between all parties in this House to establish that vital consensus needed to take us to spending 3% of GDP on defence as soon as possible? The Prime Minister will know that for months we Liberal Democrats have urged the government to seize the frozen Russian assets, which amount to over £20 billion, and repurpose those funds for Ukraine's defence. So will he take immediate steps to gather European leaders and begin the seizure of Russian assets so that we can support Ukraine no matter what America does? And will he, on his trip to Washington, try to persuade President Trump to do the same, to make Russia pay? The Prime Minister will know that the whole country will be willing him on, hoping that he might be able to persuade Donald Trump to change his mind on Ukraine. We on these benches think he is right to try. But should that not work, Mr. Speaker? Will he be clear where the United Kingdom then stands? And will he make it clear that if necessary, if absolutely necessary, it will be with Ukraine and our European allies, not Putin and Trump?
Prime Minister.
Can I firstly thank him for his support on Ukraine? It's been steadfast and it's been across this House, and for the same reasons as I replied to the Leader of the Opposition, it is important, not just here but to those in Ukraine. We do need to step up and lead in Europe. We've been saying that for a very long time. All European countries need to do more, and now is the moment to do so. But we need to do that together with the US, because what is needed more than anything is a lasting peace, a ceasefire that simply gives Putin the chance to regroup and to go again is in nobody's interest. A lasting peace means that we must talk about issues like security guarantees. We are prepared to play our part, as I've already indicated, but I've also indicated that to be a security guarantee, it also requires a US backstop, US support for that security guarantee, and that will be at the heart of the case that I've been making for some time. On the question of assets, as he knows, of the assets that have been seized already, the interest on those of £3 billion has already been committed to Ukraine, and we are working with our European allies to see what more can be done in relation to the funding that's going to be necessary. Stepping up means stepping up on capability, coordination, and stepping up on funding, which is what we've done today with this statement.
Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Dame Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's statement today and this strong commitment to defence spending. And I welcome as well the work being done with the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary on ensuring that we get every value we can for the pound that's spent in delivering capability. Will the Prime Minister also reaffirm his commitment to the parliamentary scrutiny of that spending, including on the most sensitive areas?
Yes, of course. It's extremely important, and she knows that well. She's absolutely right to say we must get value for money. This is a huge increase in defence spending. It's very important it's used on the right capabilities in the right way, and that's why we intend to get a much better grip on the money that will be put in.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr Speaker, can I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement? I personally think it's a start, not a finish. I think we will find we will have to be raising defence spending further, but I welcome it nonetheless, and I, on behalf of all of this House as well, and my right honourable friend, will support that as he goes forward. He's due to go to Washington, and one of the problems we've got there is that they seem to have reached the conclusion that peace is simply the absence of war. Can he make sure that he reminds the President that a peace without justice and the right to freedom and choice in democracy is not peace, but a partial ceasefire? And what I also say to him, he might just go and remind the President that the last great test that we faced united the United Kingdom and America, with Lady Thatcher and Ronald Reagan taking decisions that moved Europe in the right direction. Can he appeal to him, instead of running around making adverse comments, perhaps to link hands with the United Kingdom to persuade the rest of Europe to step up as we are now stepping up?
Prime Minister.
Can I firstly thank him for his support, and the point he makes about a lasting peace and what it must be is really important, because this isn't about just stopping the fighting. It is about an enduring and lasting peace for Europe, and of course the sovereignty of Ukraine, the sovereign ability to choose the alliances that Ukrainian people want, to choose their own government, to choose how they defend themselves in conjunction with others. That is the sovereignty that is in issue here. This isn't just about the sovereignty of Ukraine, but it is about the sovereignty of Ukraine. It is also about the values and freedoms across Europe, including our values and freedoms. And that is why this is such an important moment to ensure that NATO is as strong as we go forward as it's been in the last 75 years, and that bond between us and the US is as strong as it's ever been. And of course that has to be part of the case, the argument, and the way in which we have stepped up today and will continue to do so.
Derek Twigg.
Mr. Speaker. Can I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's statement, and particularly his commitment to accelerate the increase in defence spending, although I do fear that we may have to visit the 3% target before the next Parliament. But can I just ask him this question? It's very important that we have a whole society approach to defence, and I ask him whether he'll be bringing forward a strategy to make that happen, and particularly around the great need to improve our reservist forces.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it does have to be a whole society response, and that's why I set that out. I'm grateful to him for raising it in my statement to the House. And of course, it has to be a driver of industrial growth and our industrial strategy.
Stephen Flynn.
Aside from a few of Putin's poodles who are not in their seats in this chamber here today, we are of course united in our support for the people of Ukraine, and indeed in wishing the Prime Minister well in his discussions with the President of the United States later this week. But I'm afraid that's where the unity ends, because whilst we support increasing defence spending, we cannot support the populist playbook of cutting foreign aid. Indeed, that's a position which was shared and agreed with by the Foreign Secretary just a matter of days ago, when he said that it would be a big strategic mistake that would allow China to step in. Why was the Foreign Secretary wrong and the Prime Minister right?
Prime Minister.
Well, let me thank him for his support on the question of Ukraine. That is important. And just to reassure him, the decision that I've taken today on development aid is not an ideological decision. I absolutely understand the importance of it. It's a very difficult and painful decision, but a necessary decision. He talks about choice. They welcome the biggest settlement since devolution in the budget, but they voted against it because they couldn't take a choice. He welcomes the increase in defence spending, but he doesn't want to say how he will fund it. Choices, grown-up choices about the future of Europe require grown-up decisions and choices, and that is what we've done.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, instability in Europe does wash up on our shores, and so can I accept the hard decision the Prime Minister has made today to invest in defence, and this means difficult decisions in international development. My question is, though, can we please invest more in cyber, given the disinformation and the cyber attacks that our country faces on a daily basis?
Well, thank you for raising this, because cyber is part of the tools for warfare these days, which is why we increased funding at the budget and why I've adjusted the 2.5 to 2.6 in the way we've presented the case to the House today.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree entirely with the strategic direction the Prime Minister has set out today. Defence and security must come first, but he does have choices about how he funds this important uplift. He and I voted together in the last Parliament against balancing the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world. Does he still think that vote was right?
Well, I'm proud of that vote. At the time, I'm proud of the work that our country's done on development, and this is not a decision that I want to make, and I absolutely want us to get back to more funding on overseas development and back increasing those capabilities. Obviously, some of that is helped if we can, as we are, get the asylum backlog down and stop using this money to pay for hotels, which is not what it's intended for. But this has been a difficult decision. He knows how much I value overseas development, how important it is. But I thought and do think that the most important thing today is to be absolutely clear about the commitment we're making on defence, to spell out the reasons we're making those decisions, and to set out penny and pound exactly how it's going to be funded. What I wasn't going to do is come to this House with a plan that was not credible and not costed, because I think that would be far worse for our country. But the tenor of what he says I do accept in terms of the importance.
Alex Baker.
Thank you,
Prime Minister for his statement and for the leadership he has shown on these issues in these uncertain times. As the Member of the Parliament for the home of the British Army, this is hugely welcome news for my constituency, and my community is ready to serve. Can I ask the Prime Minister what he is going to do to help create jobs in our defence sector in my community?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for her question, and her constituency and constituents are obviously hardwired into this in the makeup of her constituency. I do think that this is an obligation, an important obligation that we must rise to, but it is also an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the jobs that will be generated through this are British jobs with British skills in all of our constituencies, and we'll endeavour to make sure that that is the case.
Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we're pleased to hear the announcement that the government will increase their defence spending to 2.5%, but we're still waiting for the SDR review to be completed, and without this we're in the dark. So will the SDR review be announced soon, and if not, can the Prime Minister outline how this additional money will be spent?
The SDR is advanced, and I will come to the House with it just as soon as we can. I want to make sure that we have properly identified the challenges and the capabilities. Now we've put the funding forward, obviously, today, so we will do that as soon as we can, and when we do, it will be a credible plan for the House.
Zuba Hamad.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his tireless efforts in trying to bring security to Ukraine, because their security is our security. But I wonder if you will agree with me that this is only possible because we are one United Kingdom. That strength, that solidarity is only possible because of our four nations working together. And will they agree with me that those that attempt to fragment that union at these perilous times do us great harm?
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree with that. I think that as the United Kingdom, we have always stood up in moments like this, and we stand up again as the United Kingdom, and we're proud to do so. This is an important moment at a juncture after 3 years of a conflict. The whole House will be aware of the consequences of decisions in coming weeks, or the potential consequences. I think it's a time for us to pull together.
Sir Julian Lewis.
President Trump says he wants his legacy to be that of a peacemaker. So in his difficult conversations with the President in a few days' time, will the Prime Minister remind him that the reason why the enforced division of Czechoslovakia before the war was a step on the road to disaster, whereas the division of Germany at the end of the war did not lead to World War III, was that the western half of Europe at the end of World War II was not demilitarized. So if there's to be a stable Ukraine after any such enforced division, there must be military protection for the unoccupied half of Ukraine.
Prime Minister.
He's right to talk about peace. It's what everybody wants, not least the Ukrainians. But it must be a lasting peace and not a temporary ceasefire. And I do agree that means it needs security guarantees. The configuration of that needs to be agreed, but it needs to be security guarantees sufficient to deter any further aggression, because otherwise it will be the ceasefire and will be the worst of outcomes for the whole of Europe.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his leadership and the announcement today, committing us to 2.6% of GDP on defence spending and 3% beyond that. This is in stark contrast to the 14 years of erosion of defence spending, of the hollowing out of our services and the service life that resulted. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the reforms being put forward by the Defence Secretary are essential to deliver deterrence and prevent further acts of Russian brutal imperialist aggression in Europe?
Prime Minister.
The reforms are really important, the strategic review is very important, and the funding is very important, because this is a moment where we must step up and play our full part in the defence of our country and the defence of Europe. And I've already said what I said about the plan that the party opposite put forward at the election. I've not quoted my words, I've quoted the words of the Institute for Government, who said it was... well, I would say what I think, but I think what they said was perfectly right, which was it wasn't properly funded, it wasn't a credible plan. We've put a credible plan before the House, and I'm glad it's been welcomed.
Where should we go? Let's Savile Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. And Plaid Cymru stands firm with the need to safeguard Ukraine's sovereignty, because international security is also national security. But the UK will now cut the already diminished foreign aid budget to fund military spending. National security calls for building peace as well as armed forces. Given the importance that overseas aid plays in preventing conflict, building democracy and curbing warmongering tyrants, and to paraphrase his Foreign Secretary, surely this too is a massive strategic and moral mistake.
Prime Minister.
Well, she's right to raise the importance of overseas development. I've said that from the dispatch box a number of times. But this is a moment where we have to step up. This is a moment where we have to increase our defence spending. Of course, everybody in this House would wish that wasn't the situation. We've had a peace dividend for many years. That has come to an end, and we have to step up, and our first duty is to keep the country safe. And in order to do that, it requires a credible plan, a difficult plan, I accept, not a plan, not a decision I wanted to make, but a credible plan for the defence and security of our country and the defence and security of Europe.
Richard Quidley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, and I agree with him that it is the beginning, not the end of the process. But does he agree it's not just how much money you spend, but how well you spend it? And will he join me in thanking all of our armed forces personnel for the commitment they show day in, day out to defending our nation?
Prime Minister.
I agree with both those propositions in terms of what we spend, how we spend it, and of course, speaking for myself, for the government, I'm sure for the whole House, we thank our armed services for what they do on our behalf day in, day out.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is without doubt that an enduring peace is only achieved if we have enduring security arrangements. So I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's announcement on defence expenditure and the commitment to it. But I would like to reiterate my observation, the observation of others, around the way that that money is spent. For a generation, we have been complacent, and there is significant dysfunctionality in the way that industry works with government on the procurement and delivery of defence capabilities in this country. I would urge him to keep his Defence Secretary in place for the duration of this Parliament, so he can so that we can, across this House, find some common purpose to deliver enduring reforms that stand the test of time. Treasury after Treasury has found it impossible to get to grips with defence expenditure. We must achieve that in this Parliament.
Prime Minister.
Well, the Defence Secretary just asked me if he could reply to that question. But the point he makes is a really important one. Procurement has not been in the right place. The grip on defence spend hasn't been in the right place, and we haven't used our businesses in the way that I think we could have done in the past. I mean, I would gently say 14 years might have been a good period to have got to grips with that. But we do need to get to grips with it. Now, I actually think it'll be welcomed by the whole House as we do so, because we do need to do that.
Louise Jones.
Of my colleagues started my career in the shadow of Putin's first invasion of Ukraine back in 2014. We knew then what Putin was capable of, and we knew then what Putin intended to do. However, our service was marked by swinging cuts from the Conservative government that left our armed forces lacking key capabilities. There's an old saying, if you want peace, prepare for war. Can the Prime Minister assure me that this extra cash will be well spent to cover those capabilities and take advantage of the new technologies we desperately need?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank her for her question, but also for her service? And she's absolutely right that this money must be well spent on the capability that we need, and it will.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the statement from the Prime Minister today, and also wish him well as he goes to America to persuade the Americans to side with democracy rather than vote with dictators. The announcement today, of course, will have a long lead-in period before we actually see the effects. And given that and the overstretched commitments of our armed forces, how can he give assurances to the Ukrainians that Britain will be able to supply arms and personnel to defend any peace agreement which is reached?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his support. On the question of security guarantees, obviously quite intense discussions are going on at how that would look, what it might involve. I'm absolutely confident that we can play our full part. I won't disclose details to the House for reasons that he will understand, but I'm confident that we can and we will play our full part in whatever security guarantees may be needed. Of course, with US backing, which is important if there to be proper guarantees.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the uplift in defence spending, but as the Prime Minister has recognised, this is a difficult decision when it comes to our aid budget. I, like many others in the House, have seen the first-hand impact that the aid budget makes, not only on tackling poverty, but on our own stability and prosperity. So I welcome what the Prime Minister has said so far, but can he reassure us that our commitment to get back to 0.7% as soon as fiscal circumstances allow still remains?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I want to see that. And I also want to reassure the House that on vital issues like Gaza, Sudan and Ukraine, notwithstanding the difficult decision that we've taken today, it is important that they are prioritised for reasons that are obvious across the House.
Other chance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While there are members across the House clearly recognise the need to invest more and indeed to invest differently in defence and security, it's obviously, unbelievably counterproductive and short-sighted to fund that by slashing aid to the poorest and most fragile countries, or indeed by squeezing already stretched departmental budgets. So can I ask the Prime Minister, why will he not fund this by increasing taxes on the most wealthy rather than placing the burden on the poorest?
Prime Minister.
I don't think that the plans, as far as I've seen them being put forward on the other side, are realistic. It is for us, if we're to make a commitment like this, to put forward a credible, costed plan where we can say with certainty precisely where the money is coming from. And that's why we've taken the difficult decision that we've taken today.
Dr. Ruperhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's statement hits the nail on the head. Unlike the rantings of J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference on European freedom of speech. So I know that it's going to be particularly welcome in the Ealing Ex-Servicemen's Club. Could I ask him, therefore, to recommit to our veterans, to the OSCE, and to organisations like the Army Cadet Centre in Acton and the TA Reservists in Wood Lane, either of which would welcome a visit, for those who have served our nation and who will do in the future?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I'm happy to make that commitment, and I'd ask her to carry that message to her constituents, along with the thanks of myself, the government, and the House.
Mr. Bernard.
Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister flies off to Washington, will he go taking the confidence that this House and indeed the whole country are behind him and wish him well in that very difficult meeting, knowing that this country and our continent is possibly facing the most dangerous moments that we have seen since the height of the Cold War? Will he also, may I also welcome the statement increasing defence spending, some of us would say a couple of decades overdue, but will he accept that the benchmark for the success of the defence review is not some arbitrary percentage of what we're spending. It's whether we are spending whatever is necessary to give back to our armed forces the war-fighting capability that is the only real deterrence that the Russians will respect. And can I say to him, I very much doubt that 2.5% or 3% will be enough, and I don't say that as a criticism, but as something, as a nation, that we must be prepared for.
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank him for his sentiment, and I think it is important at a moment like this that I'm able to carry the House with me as we undertake the next stage of these discussions about the security and defence of Europe, because it is a very important generational moment, and this House and this country have always come together and stood up at moments like this. Look, I know he's been a long supporter of increased defence spending and capability, and the notion that there must be a war-fighting capability. He's right about that, and that's why we've made the decision we have today.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement and his strong leadership. Does the Prime Minister agree that as we rightly reassert the concept of taking responsibility by our own people, military and economy, but also by our friends on the continent of Europe, we must also reassert the responsibility of all countries to defend the international rules-based system that has at its core the concept that bullies must not get away with invading their neighbours. Because if they do, not only will we dishonour the bravery and sacrifice of our Ukrainian friends, but also our collective security will be weakened.
Prime Minister.
Well, two of those rules-based systems are fundamental. The UN Charter and the NATO framework, and all of the articles in it. Hugely important rules-based frameworks that we must absolutely adhere to. And I wrote many times about the UN Security Council as a lawyer. My first appearance at the Security Council was sitting around a table with a country that was in clear violation of the Charter itself, and I did not feel at all comfortable.
Victoria Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 years ago,